It was a quiet Sunday afternoon on April 23, 2006, in Medicine Hat, Alberta, a peaceful, unsuspecting neighborhood where families gathered to enjoy a long weekend together. The air was fresh, with the scent of spring blooming, and the sunlight streamed through the windows of the Richardson family home, casting a warm, golden hue across the rooms. Birds chirped lazily outside, adding a natural soundtrack to the day. Inside, 42-year-old Mark Richardson, his wife Deborah, and their two children, 8-year-old Tyler and 12-year-old Jasmine, were enjoying their time at home, unaware that the tranquility of their lives was about to be shattered. The family was settling into a routine, their house filled with the usual hum of daily life, playful chatter, laughter, and the comforting rhythm of family time. Jasmine, a bright 12-year-old girl who had recently developed an interest in the goth subculture, was at odds with her parents, but still, there were no signs of anything sinister brewing. Her parents, while concerned about her increasingly rebellious behavior, assumed it was typical teenage angst, something they would eventually work through together. But underneath this facade of normalcy, dark clouds were beginning to gather. The Richardson family's home had become a battleground of sorts between Jasmine and her parents. Her social media activity had raised red flags. Her posts about serial killers and violent fantasies were concerning, but like most parents, Mark and Deborah chalked it up to rebellious teenage expression. What they didn't know was that Jasmine's obsession had gone much further than mere fascination. In the weeks leading up to this fateful day, Jasmine had been sneaking out to meet her much older boyfriend, Jeremy Steinke, a 23-year-old man who had introduced her to the goth subculture and shared her dark, disturbing interests. The two communicated constantly, plotting their future together, fueled by Jasmine's desire to escape her home life and Steinke's unhealthy obsession with violence. For them, it was an intense, passionate, and forbidden relationship, one that would spiral into unimaginable violence. At around 1 p.m., a young friend of Tyler's arrived for a playdate. She entered the Richardson house and called out for him, expecting the usual lively greeting. But there was an eerie silence. She wandered through the house, wondering where Tyler had gone. As she made her way through the home, she noticed something was wrong. The basement door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, she saw something horrifying: blood. Terrified, the young girl screamed and bolted out of the house to alert her mother, who immediately called the police. When officers arrived, they were met with a scene more horrific than anything they could have imagined. Mark Richardson, 42, was found in the basement, stabbed 24 times. His wife, Deborah, 48, lay nearby, also brutally stabbed 12 times. Upstairs, Tyler, the young boy, had been murdered in his bedroom, his throat slit, and stab wounds to his head and torso. But there was one thing missing, a crucial piece of the puzzle. Jasmine, the 12-year-old daughter, was nowhere to be found. The discovery sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community. How could something like this happen in a quiet, family-oriented neighborhood? The brutality of the murders, the viciousness with which the family had been killed, was shocking enough. But the fact that their own daughter was missing added a layer of terror and confusion. For a while, investigators feared that Jasmine might have been the next victim, perhaps taken by a stranger, or worse, the killer still hiding in the house. But the truth was far more chilling. Jasmine was not the victim, she was the perpetrator. The investigation would soon reveal that Jasmine and her 23-year-old boyfriend, Jeremy Steinke, had planned the murders together. The evidence was chilling. A stick figure drawing depicting the murder of her family had been found inside Jasmine's school locker. What followed was a swift pursuit. The next day, Jasmine and Steinke were found in Leader, Saskatchewan, some 130 kilometers away from Medicine Hat. They were arrested, and the unthinkable truth came to light. Jasmine Richardson, barely 13 years old, was arrested for the brutal slaying of her parents and little brother. As the investigation into the Richardson family murders unfolded, the shocking truth about the perpetrators came to light. Jasmine Richardson, only 12 years old at the time, had masterminded the brutal killings of her parents, Mark and Deborah, and her 8-year-old brother, Tyler. But how could a young girl, so innocent in the eyes of most, commit such a horrific crime? And what was the role of her 23-year-old boyfriend, Jeremy Steinke, in the murders? The answers were found in a dark and twisted relationship, one that had spiraled into a deadly obsession. Jasmine's connection with Steinke was central to understanding the motive behind the murders. Steinke, a troubled young man who had a history of violent fantasies and self-destructive behavior, was introduced to Jasmine through a mutual friend in the goth subculture. Their bond was immediate, fueled by shared interests in rebellion, violence, and a fascination with death. Jasmine had been living a life of escalating rebellion. She had distanced herself from her family and immersed herself in online communities where she could express her darker interests. Her social media profiles were filled with disturbing content, obsessions with serial killers, violent fantasies, and even references to kinky acts. Jasmine, who had been raised by recovering drug addicts, felt alienated by her parents' rules and their attempts to control her. The more they pushed, the more she pushed back. But it wasn't just the strictness of her parents that led to her break. Jasmine harbored deep resentment, especially toward her younger brother, Tyler. According to Steinke, Jasmine had once strangled her brother in a fit of anger. She had also made it clear that she was embarrassed by his presence at family events, something she openly discussed with her friends. Jasmine's feelings of alienation and anger had slowly festered into hatred. When she met Steinke, her fantasies of running away from her family turned into a deadly plan. She began discussing the idea of killing her parents with him. Steinke, already fascinated by violence and death, encouraged the idea, feeding into Jasmine's delusions of a life free from parental control. Together, they began to plot the murders. The night before the killings, Steinke and Jasmine communicated through online messages, further solidifying their dark intentions. Jasmine had told Steinke that her family was unfair to her, and that killing them would solve all of her problems. The murder of her parents was no longer a fantasy. It was a reality they were both willing to make happen. At 1 p.m. on April 23, 2006, Steinke entered the Richardson home through a basement window. He was high on drugs, drunk, and fueled by his obsession with death. When Deborah Richardson heard the noise, she went to investigate. Steinke lunged at her, stabbing her repeatedly with a knife. Mark, hearing his wife's screams, rushed to the basement to protect her, but he too was overpowered. As Mark lay dying, his final words were a desperate plea, asking Steinke why he was doing this. Steinke's chilling response was, "Because it's what your daughter wanted." Upstairs, young Tyler had heard the commotion and was frightened. The boy, unaware of the horrors unfolding below, was caught in the chaos. He tried to flee, but was swiftly overpowered. His throat was slit, and his body was brutally stabbed in a crime that seemed to defy any semblance of mercy. Some investigators would later speculate that Jasmine might have been involved in her brother's death, but Steinke insisted it was his doing. The details of who killed whom remained debated, but what was clear was the complete disregard for human life on the part of both Steinke and Jasmine. After the murders were committed, the two killers were not in a state of remorse or shock. They were calm, even triumphant. Jasmine, instead of fleeing in terror or shock, helped cover their tracks. She rinsed off the murder weapon and stuffed it into a bag along with some of her mother's belongings. Using her mother's credit card, she withdrew cash from an ATM and then took a taxi to Steinke's trailer. Together, they had sex, as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just slaughtered an entire family. But the most chilling part of the aftermath wasn't their escape. It was their complete indifference. Hours later, they attended a party, laughing and joking as if they had not just committed a monstrous crime. Steinke, showing off his eye injury from a scuffle with Mark, proudly boasted to partygoers that he had killed his girlfriend's family. Jasmine calmly corroborated his story, even adding in a disturbing detail about her brother's final moments. "My little brother gargled." The true extent of Jasmine's involvement in the murders began to emerge in the days that followed. The police, initially concerned for her safety, quickly realized she was not the victim. She was the mastermind. Evidence from her school locker, where a drawing depicted her family being murdered, painted a clear picture of her intentions. She had planned this act with a cold, calculating mind. The girl who had once been a straight-A student, involved in fine arts and deeply connected to her community, had been consumed by a dark force, leading her to plot the deaths of the people closest to her. Her relationship with Steinke was the catalyst, but the roots of her anger and frustration ran deeper. The crimes were not just an act of rebellion. They were a manifestation of her hatred for the world that had restricted her, for the family that had tried to control her life. Steinke, a man with his own troubled past and violent tendencies, had only fed into Jasmine's delusions. Together, they had created a plan that would change their lives, and the lives of the Richardson family, forever. As the chilling details of the Richardson family murders continued to unfold, investigators and psychologists alike began to dive deeper into the twisted psyche of the perpetrators, particularly Jasmine Richardson. How could a 12-year-old girl, once described as a bright and talented student, become capable of planning and executing the brutal murders of her own family? And what role did Jeremy Steinke, a 23-year-old man with his own troubled history, play in this nightmarish crime? To understand the motivations behind these murders, we must first look at the backgrounds of both Jasmine and Jeremy, two deeply scarred individuals who found each other in a shared dark fantasy. Jasmine had always been a complex child, a girl who seemed to live a double life. On the surface, she appeared to be a typical preteen, excelling academically and socially. She made the honor roll at school, was active in fine arts, and maintained a wide circle of friends. But as she entered her teenage years, something changed. Her interests shifted, and her behavior began to deteriorate. She grew increasingly rebellious, acting out against her parents and their authority. Her parents, Mark and Deborah, had worked hard to provide Jasmine with a better life. Both had overcome significant struggles with drug addiction, and they were determined to raise their children in a stable, drug-free environment. But this effort, though well-meaning, led to friction between Jasmine and her parents. They tried to enforce rules, but Jasmine resisted them, growing angrier and more isolated with each passing day. Her social media activity raised serious concerns. Jasmine created profiles on websites like MySpace and Zorpia, where she falsified her age, claimed to be bisexual, and posted provocative photos. She expressed fascination with dark subjects like serial killers, scarification, and violent fantasies. Her obsession with these topics wasn't just a phase. It was a window into her disturbed mind, one that had begun to spiral out of control. As her fascination with goth culture deepened, Jasmine distanced herself from her family and began to idolize figures like American serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer and musician Marilyn Manson. She started frequenting the Medicine Hat Mall, where she encountered a group of older goth kids who would later become her friends, and ultimately her accomplices. This group introduced her to Jeremy Steinke, a 23-year-old man who would become the most influential person in her life. Jeremy Steinke's own background was riddled with abuse, neglect, and violent tendencies. Born into a chaotic, abusive household, Steinke's early years were filled with physical and emotional trauma. He had been brutally mistreated by both his biological father and his stepfathers. The violence he endured led to a deep sense of isolation, and by the time he was a teenager, Steinke had become withdrawn and angry. He struggled to make friends, bullied at school, and had no real sense of stability. As Steinke grew older, he turned to substances to numb the pain. Alcohol and drugs became his escape, and his self-destructive behavior only escalated. By the time he was 23, he had already dropped out of high school, moved from one failed job to the next, and became involved in the goth subculture, where his dark fantasies grew more pronounced. On his social media accounts, Steinke openly expressed his love for violence, even going so far as to share disturbing fantasies about killing prostitutes and playing with their insides. When Steinke met Jasmine in early 2006, he was immediately captivated by her. She was young, rebellious, and seemingly eager to embrace his twisted world. For Jasmine, Steinke offered a way out of her controlling home life, a chance to escape the oppressive rules of her parents and live freely in a dark, chaotic world of their own making. For Steinke, Jasmine represented a vulnerability he could manipulate, and he quickly ingrained himself into her life. Despite warnings from his friends, who expressed disgust over the age difference between him and Jasmine, Steinke continued the relationship, convinced that their bond was something special. Jasmine, for her part, became increasingly enamored with Steinke, and together, they began planning the unthinkable. By early 2006, Jasmine and Steinke's relationship had taken a sinister turn. They communicated frequently, sharing their dark thoughts and plans. Jasmine's desire to rid herself of her family grew stronger, fueled by her animosity toward her parents and her fixation on a life with Steinke. She told him she wanted to kill her parents, and Steinke, ever eager to indulge her fantasies, agreed. In their twisted minds, the murders were not just a way to escape her oppressive home life. They were an act of freedom, a declaration of their love, and a path to a life without limits. Jasmine's behavior became more erratic. She expressed to friends that she was planning to kill her parents, but most dismissed it as another rebellious outburst. No one realized how serious she was, nor how deeply her hatred for her family had taken root. Jasmine had drawn a stick figure illustration depicting her family's murders in her locker at school, an ominous and chilling clue that was ignored until it was too late. After the murders, Jasmine and Steinke fled to Leader, Saskatchewan, where they were apprehended the following day. Jasmine, still only 12 years old, and Steinke, 23, were arrested together, and the police quickly pieced together the horrifying details of their crime. Evidence found at the scene, including the disturbing drawings in Jasmine's school locker, confirmed the investigators' worst fears. Jasmine, the youngest person in Canada to ever be involved in multiple first-degree murders, was not a victim but a perpetrator. Despite her young age, Jasmine's actions during and after the murders were deeply disturbing. She had not shown any signs of remorse. Instead, she had helped Steinke cover their tracks and even participated in casual conversations about the murders with others at a party just hours afterward. Jasmine's behavior left many struggling to understand how a 12-year-old girl could become so violent, so detached from the gravity of her actions. The community was left reeling from the discovery that such a young girl could be capable of such brutality. It became clear that something had gone terribly wrong in Jasmine's life, something dark that had been allowed to grow unchecked, leading to this horrific outcome. Jasmine Richardson's trial was a media spectacle. At just 13 years old, she was the youngest person in Canada to be convicted of multiple first-degree murders. Under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, her name was protected from public disclosure for a time, and the proceedings surrounding her trial were tightly controlled. The Canadian legal system had no precedent for a case like hers, and her age complicated the process. In July 2007, Jasmine was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of her parents and brother. Given her age, the law allowed for a maximum sentence of 10 years, a sentence that sparked outrage among many who felt that such a lenient punishment was insufficient for the gravity of the crime. The court system had to balance the severity of her actions with her young age, and the result was a controversial sentence. Jasmine was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with credit for the 18 months she had already served. Her sentence included psychiatric care in a secure facility and conditional supervision upon her release. The court's decision was met with mixed emotions. For some, it was difficult to reconcile the fact that a 12-year-old girl could commit such heinous acts and receive a sentence that allowed for her eventual release. For others, the focus was on Jasmine's age and the possibility of rehabilitation, questioning whether a young girl who had been raised in a chaotic, violent environment could ever truly be held accountable for her actions. Jeremy Steinke's trial was equally shocking. At 23 years old, Steinke was tried as an adult for the murders of the Richardson family. His defense during the trial was largely based on the claim that Jasmine had been the mastermind behind the murders and that he had been manipulated by her. Steinke's defense also attempted to focus on his troubled childhood and the abuse he had suffered, hoping to garner some sympathy from the court. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming. His involvement in the murders was undeniable, and his actions after the crime, including bragging about the murders to friends at a party, solidified his role as a cold-blooded killer. In December 2008, Steinke was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each murder, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Steinke's sentence, while harsh, was seen as a reflection of the severity of his crimes. The public, however, remained divided. Some believed he should have received a harsher sentence for his role in the killings, while others focused on his own troubled background as a mitigating factor. The case highlighted a tragic reality. Two lives, one a troubled adult and the other a young girl, had collided in a horrific act of violence, leaving a family destroyed and a community forever scarred. The Richardson family murders left lasting scars on the community of Medicine Hat. For the families of Mark, Deborah, and Tyler, there would be no true closure. While justice had been served in the courtroom, the emotional toll of losing their loved ones in such a brutal and senseless manner could never be fully healed. Jasmine's rehabilitation became a focal point for many. After spending time in a psychiatric institution, she was released in 2011, having completed her sentence. Reports indicated that she showed genuine remorse for her actions, and she began to attend classes at Mount Royal University in Calgary. While some experts believed that Jasmine's rehabilitation was progressing well, others were skeptical, unsure whether the young girl who had committed such terrible acts had truly changed. Steinke, for his part, was incarcerated and began the long road to serving his life sentence. Over the years, he changed his name to Jackson May, reportedly in honor of his late mother. He expressed a desire to distance himself from the name Steinke, a name forever associated with the murders of the Richardson family. The legacy of the murders continues to affect the families of the victims. Mark and Deborah's surviving relatives and friends continue to live with the pain of their tragic deaths. Tyler's young life was cut short, and the memories of what might have been will haunt his loved ones forever. For the community of Medicine Hat, the Richardson family murders serve as a somber reminder of how easily things can spiral into violence. Jasmine's descent into darkness, catalyzed by her relationship with Steinke, is a tragic story of a young girl whose fantasies and discontent turned into something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The murders of Mark, Deborah, and Tyler Richardson were a shocking example of how an unhealthy, obsessive relationship can destroy lives, not just for the victims but for the perpetrators as well. Jasmine and Jeremy's actions were driven by a twisted form of love and rebellion, but in the end, they caused irreversible harm. While justice has been served, the damage is done. The scars left on the Richardson family, the community of Medicine Hat, and the lives of the killers will last a lifetime. If you found this story gripping, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to stay up to date with more true crime cases. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about Jasmine's sentence? Was justice truly served in this case? Let's keep the conversation going and reflect on the lasting impact of this tragic crime.